Our third speaker in this session is Scott Bouvier, who's a partner in King & Wood Mallisons. Scott's had a huge amount of involvement in a range of different areas, a lot of it in terms of advisory work for some of the major agribusiness organisations in Australia, and also through his involvement with the Australian Food and Grocery Council and the Business Council of Australia, and as advisor to a range of different companies and even some of the universities. So his perspective on where things are heading and what sort of things Australia should be doing in terms of the whole issue of the future of agricultural trade will be a much more practical one, but I'm sure equally as interesting in terms of thinking about what the future might look like. So please welcome Scott.
Thanks, Mick, and it's great to be here. I suppose to put in context, and there's not going to be, mine's presentation's a lot more anecdotal, a lot more based on my experience, but in a sense, why is a lawyer sort of qualified to be here, and why can I talk about these things? I suppose in context, and many of you know this story, but Mallisons is a 180-year-old law firm. I've been with them, they're Australian-based. It sort of starts off with Montague Stevens coming off a boat in Sydney Harbour in about 1848, and we've built really what was the first national firm in Australia from there. I joined that firm in 1988, so 27 years ago, but 3 and a bit years ago we merged with King & Wood, which was a 22-year-old Chinese firm, their leading firm in China, and we became half Chinese. Now, as part of that expansion, we then merged with a European firm, S.J. Berwin, which was a strong firm across Europe, and we've become the 10th largest law firm in the world. So we're sort of part of the Australia, China and global investment trade mix. We've put ourselves in the middle of it, and in a sense we've taken the risk of it and risk of all the regulatory issues that can arise. But that's really primarily to take advantage of the themes that Kim talked about, and that is to put ourselves in the middle of Asia as the only global firm headquartered in Asia, focused on the rise of Asian economies and designed to really understand the markets, understand the regulatory risks and the commercial side as well. So I've had a big learning curve over the last few years. Combined with that, a little bit earlier before we merged, we started an agribusiness focused group within the firm. We acted for a lot of major agribusiness players, but we started to become much more involved in the sector. So over the last, say, 4 years, I've been talking at conferences, I've been meeting a lot of people, I've been learning a lot, as with many of my other partners, about the industry, and then that led to a lot of work in China in terms of promoting trade and investment in Australian food and agribusiness. So I've had about 4 trips to China where we spend really a week each time talking to Chinese clients about opportunities. This isn't just about China, it could be about KKR investing in a $100 million greenhouse down at Port Augusta, an amazing play in terms of the Australian agricultural industry. It can be private equity looking at what they're doing, but there's a lot going on. So hopefully through my presentation I'll filter some of that. I'll also adjust a little bit because I understand that you're mainly it's a government, it's a trade organisation, it's more of an industry forum with a couple of commercial players. So perhaps the way I'll put some of this is really as to what I think should be happening in terms of your conversations with commercial organisations to take advantage of some of these opportunities and also managing some of these risks. That's really broadly what this presentation will cover, and it's how do we make keeping abreast of the potential opportunities, how do we realise them and managing the risks. And I think a lot of this is really directed at that commercial organisation, but I'll give you what my view is and some of the anecdotal stories that I've collected along the way. We all know these things. There's been a lot of policy development at the domestic level. There was some stuff in the budget that's going to make it a bit more positive for investment, small investment. It'll help, and not every Chinese or other investments into a $200 million thing. There's a lot of $5 and $10 million investments that will be going into businesses that qualify for these depreciation measures, and it will make a difference. There's the free trade assistance that, in terms of Austrade and what it's going to do, and You know, I've worked a lot with Austrade in China, and I think they do an amazing job, particularly there, in terms of really bringing in opportunities. And if, you know, that could be doubled, and then obviously even more so in other economies, I think that'll be good for our economy. The industry growth measures, what's happening there, there's a lot of support there with industry, and hopefully that'll be built. And there's, you know, the pending papers on Northern Australia and also the agricultural competitiveness paper, and hopefully some opportunities there to really lift the game in terms of our policy framework. So there's a lot of things pointing in the right direction for this sector. I think, you know, we'd all wish there could be more and it could be faster, and perhaps there'd be other changes, but it's pointing in the right direction. You know, we have these free trade agreements, and for better or worse, I know personally the Chinese one will, and I'll highlight this a bit later on. Tariffs, yes, that'll help, but really the sign of and the mark of approval that free trade agreement has given to Chinese companies about investment and trade with Australia is probably the key thing. It really has, in a sense, heightened our position within the Chinese market, and there is going to be more investment, and there is more investment that's going to happen. There was one investment that we're looking at recently, which the Chinese client was asked to invest more into it because they wanted to see a bigger commitment, and this was the government encouraging this company to invest more into this venture because they wanted to see more happening in terms of that particular investment. So, you know, we have the details, or we have the negotiation of the free trade agreement, and the details of the hundreds of pages of detail are imminent. I'm not sure what was forecast yesterday, so I better not say any more than what was forecast yesterday. But that is, you know, it's not far away. We will get those full details, but we probably pretty well know what the story is anyway. And, you know, that's, you would have learned about the tariffs, etc. And I won't go through this for this audience. And obviously there were the winners and losers there in terms of agriculture, and there's the analysis as to, you know, our main sectors of wool and cotton didn't get a better deal, but the sectors which China has directed us to service them in, you know, reflecting their current policy needs in terms of beef and dairy and horticulture, etc., they have promoted. And if you don't have a snappy summary of all of the tariffs, then hopefully that one page will give you that idea. But picking up a point that Kim made, and I think this leads to the self-sufficiency point as well, it's not just about the goods, it's also about our opportunities in relation to sharing technology. There was that, I thought, a very impressive paper that we did a few years ago about feeding the future, the joint Australia-China paper about how we build better relationships on the agricultural side, and one was the trade and investment side, but the other was very much sharing R&D opportunities. And, you know, there is a great story there and a great opportunity for Australian agriculture to build capacity in China. And, you know, I'm aware of Sydney markets doing work in China to help build up their know-how and capability in markets. I know there's food safety groups that are advising Chinese markets on actually their standards as well. We have a former, the lawyer who was the general counsel in the Walmart scare in China when they substituted pork, who spent sort of 6 or 7 weeks helping its clients who were in jail and then out of jail and doing all that. He's now one of our partners in China. And so he has quite a big practice in actual risk management in the food safety area. And that is, you know, building up those compliance practices and policies, and he's drawing on Australian expertise, commercial expertise in bringing that education there. And I think really that's, you know, we're not selling the farm, not selling our know-how with any of these stories. The realistic position is we're not going to meet all the needs in China, and it's better that we work and share our skills, and, you know, it's not a one-way street, it should be 2 ways, and build up that capacity there and make them more self-sufficient, or, you know, have greater confidence in many of their own food products. There's not just stories like that. There's Australian reproductive technologies with their IVF technology that they're doing with Shanghai Dairy. Consistently, when I have conversations in China, it is about trade, it's about investment, it's about IP as well. It's about genetics, it could be know-how, and a lot of the trade and investment need is, yes, it's about fulfilling a market, but it's also getting access or experience with farm practices, with processing practices, with brand development, how to build a market. So you've got Bright Foods' investment into Monason, which is really a branded food business, and that's to bring brands to China, but it's also to build that expertise. And there's other companies like that are looking to make that similar investment as well. So I think the free trade agreement, it is great from a tariffs point of view, but also there are opportunities in the R&D space, and I think that should be linked into the thinking about. And I should also mention, now look at Lionel, the CSIRO's Novak deal in terms of the prawn feeding technology, another example of some of the things that are happening. We know that, as I said before, that Australia wants to build its competitiveness, it wants to improve its infrastructure, and it is looking to attract investment into the agri sector. The FIRB rules, our experience is they're not turning away investment. We have Malcolm Brennan, who does something like 26% of the FIRB applications in Australia, and it's working with clients. It's just part of the process. They know when they invest in Australia, there is a process to go through, and we've got a very confident and if you manage it properly, the outcomes are invariably approval. But we don't see the new changes in terms of the $50 million threshold or the $55 million mooted or proposed agribusiness threshold as scaring away investment. It's just going to be a process. The fees aren't great. The fees that could be up to $100,000 on an agri investment, with comments that it's in terms of the proportionality to the cost recovery there are out of whack. But I think the other parts of it are all workable with encouraging investment into Australia. So I think the things are all pointing in the right direction. One of the great opportunities, I think, and really I think it's one of the opportunities and challenges and, in a sense, responsibilities for everybody involved in the sector is the whole education side. And it's turning this complex maze of regulations, say, on how to export something from Australia into something that an Australian exporter, Australian small to medium enterprise can actually understand and grapple with and export its product overseas, both on the export side and the import side there. So I think the Department of Ag and the various rules and trade access, I think there's such an opportunity to make that much more able to be accessed, understood, and to educate the Australian exporter to actually how to do that. The other side is really just building market capability in the overseas markets, whether it's China or elsewhere. It's that focus. I think there was a PwC survey a few months ago which talked about our experience with dealing in China. It had such something like a 9% figure in terms of actual experience. We're watching and working with quite large Australian companies at the moment who may have been in China 10 or 15 years ago, got burnt, and are going back there and starting to make its initial steps about building its markets into China and doing that. And they're trying to develop those skills or bring those skills in, but there's not a lot of it around. And you contrast it with companies like Cargill, who've been in China for a long time and have that deep experience. And that's one of our challenges, that we don't have that deep Chinese experience. So, that's a pithy little slide in terms of how to encourage it. But as you've seen, that our share of markets is declining. So we haven't quite, it's not a lay down misère that we will capture this opportunity. There's a lot that we need to do. And I think these are the messages that I put out put an article in The Land, I've put it in our Agri-Thinking magazine, and it's about, what do we need to be doing? And a lot of these things are quite obvious things about, understanding your market, and that's something that there's investment that have gone into FIAL, I think, about understanding the Chinese consumer. There's research that I think it's one of the export grains research organisations is doing about, understanding the Asian consumer. What do they want? Start from that point of view of the consumer, and I'm sure that'll be a theme of the BCA as well. So we've got to look at, well, what is our market? And I think, the commodity markets like wheat are our biggest risk from a self-sufficiency point of view. There's not China wants to be self-sufficient in wheat. Is that where we put our new investment, or, it's the value added, the cereals, the complex cereals, the health-related things, those markets where, we will have that difference. We won't butt up against the self-sufficiency measure quite as much. And then there's the sort of how do I get started question, and that's where a lot of the Australian business, many of them, I think it's Mulberry Exports, who've been selling meat to China for a long time, primarily to hotel chains. Its focus is, doesn't think China, it's hotel chains, or maybe even just a couple of chains. I met with a state-owned enterprise in Beijing who did the catering for the party in Beijing, and that's a massive enterprise in itself, and you could almost run a business if supplying that customer. So, is it the hotel, restaurant, catering sector? Is it a particular city? Educating, whether it's China or elsewhere, that we should be looking at those niche opportunities. And niche is obviously massive. It's the how to get started thing. It's it was one of the great difficulties, and we're having, it's a risk and a difficulty. The middlemen who are coming in and helping from Australia, the Chinese relationships, take Australian exporters into China, and through complicated trade routes, through a free trade zone and moving it around there, are obviously getting product into China, but as to how much they're sort of taking along the way, and is that really the best way to proceed? There is a real challenge with understanding the Chinese regulatory environment, and the middlemen are taking positions on that to help smooth that through. But I think there is a way to get beyond that, and that's really to go and talk with the regulator yourself in China and to build those more direct relationships. That's where the Chinese Mandarin skills, we don't have as much strength there, that need to be developed. But I think getting in there and building those relationships, and whether it's with the Chinese, not so much with the middlemen here, but with those bigger companies in China, and build that relationship. So that's certainly what we're encouraging, and this is the little graphic that we've just started to use, is in terms of thinking, well, how do we move from the Chinese who are thinking about all the opportunities here and have all the capital here, and trying to educate, I suppose, or explain the opportunity to the Australian family farm, the corporate family farm, and how can we do a joint venture? And I think it's quite, and we're seeing these common companies being formed, investing in new infrastructure, owning that new infrastructure, perhaps owning the related land, and really investing about the upside, not taking away from what you're doing now, but using this new venture to really build that upside, and not only get the capital into it, but also, as importantly, get the market access and get that market know-how. So the capital can come from anywhere, and the interest is, and the capital is coming from anywhere, but if you can combine Chinese capital with market access, well then you'll have, I think, a much stronger opportunity, and put in your off-takes with your basis point agreements or whatever they are, to really underpin and finance those sorts of ventures. So I've only got a couple of minutes, so understanding the consumer is also about understanding your product and how to tailor it and adjust it to the Chinese market. As an IP lawyer, I've got strong views about brands and how you protect that, and it is something that, with branded products, you really need to be getting onto early. Australian companies about getting in early on trademarks in China, and how to do that, and also just having the Chinese language trademark. You know, I've got my Chinese name. It's not the same as Scott. It's apparently something like I'm knowledgeable and I come from a land of plenty. So it was designed to support my agribusiness focus in China. But you know, getting those sort of brands in China that you know, in Mandarin that actually echo, and really throughout whole of Asia because of the rise of Chinese language throughout all of Asia. I will, and through all of this, I'll make there's how you manage your supply chain, your distribution chain risks, but in particular on the regulatory risks, to pick up a point that Kim made. It's clear that, you know, there's obviously at a broader level, the government changed, the Chinese government and other governments changes its policies and have focuses on self-sufficiency, and it can change very quickly. And obviously tying yourself into one market based on one loophole or maybe one free trade zone is a pretty hazardous route. You'll just have to continually monitor and manage that risk across your markets. And you know, there's the work required, as this slide shows, you know, to try and export beef to China. It's a really complicated process, and there's 1 to 2 years of approvals you need to go through. You won't read that. I think we'll be sharing the slides later on, and it's in a report that we're bringing out soon. But there's a 1 to 2 year process, and there's a hell of a lot of forms, or I call it forms to fill in, certifications to get, etc., to set that up. But it can change. You know, the chilled meat can get cancelled, and you might need to go back to square one on that. So managing that regulatory risk, you know, it's the SME's got to try and do it, but I think all of the various agencies should help with sort of that information side of that and making that information easily available. Contract risks, these are the messages that I would share with a commercial client. You know, they're going to increasingly have to deal in PRC law. It's not that different. It's pretty similar to Australian law. It's not as evolved. You always go for arbitration, and there are some tips that you would do for arbitration, and you can enforce arbitration judgments in China, and particularly if you follow particular protocols. And in many cases, that's the only way you'll be able to do that. I suppose, you know, we have 1,000 lawyers in China, and they're busy advising mainly foreign companies in China about how to do business. We've got 200 of them are IP lawyers. They protect IP all the time. They don't do any counterfeiting. So none of their practice is counterfeit work. They're out there doing sophisticated IP work. They stop IP infringements. They protect it. It's a very sophisticated it's a very sophisticated IP market, and the commercial and legal environment is increasingly sophisticated, and you know, you should have some confidence in it. It won't be as 100% confident here, but it won't be also as expensive as here to actually resolve a dispute. I'll make a few of those points in that slide. So I think I'll end there with another nice little graphic. I would say, and I did say this before, about taking advantage of Austrade, the trade investment offices, I think the growth centres. I think that outreach through those, but also with the Department of Agriculture, and more so in that space, I think will be really important in terms of realising these opportunities. We have the lower tariffs. Hopefully there'll be more clarity on the non-tariff trade barriers. If they can be worked through more in terms of access, and that can be done more quickly, all the better. But I think it's giving people confidence that there is, you know, how to do it, and to simplify, keep it in simpler tones, to encourage more Australian agribusinesses to sort of look out more broadly and develop its markets. And yes, I've got a Chinese bent because of being 1/3 Chinese, but you know, and Kim rightly highlights it's the largest opportunity, but it's not the only opportunity. So I don't mean to. My comments today shouldn't be construed as saying it's the only opportunity. So I look forward to any questions. Thanks.